Delve is a mechanic in Magic the Gathering that allows the caster to help pay for their spells by exiling cards from the graveyard. For each card exiled, it reduces the cost of the mana you actually have to pay by 1. Delve only appeared in 2 sets, but has been an incredibly powerful keyword throughout Magic's history. So today we're looking at Delve's short but potent history of the game and going over some of the best cards with this mechanic. And at number 10, we have Tasigur the Golden Fang. Tasigur is a 6-mana creature with 4 power and 5 toughness who can cost a single black mana thanks to Delve. Tasigur's ability allows the player to pay 4 mana and send the top 2 cards of their deck to the graveyard. Then the Tasigur player selects an opponent, and that opponent must put a non-land card from Tasigur's player's graveyard back into the player's hand. Essentially, Tasigur allows the user to rebuy their spells in the graveyard, but only the ones an opponent allows them to have. While this is limiting, there are ways around this. For one, Delve as a mechanic removes several cards from a player's graveyard to cast a spell. When playing Tasigur, the player can remove the most irrelevant cards in the graveyard to force the opponent to give them back something more potent. His own ability also refills the graveyard when there's a lack of targets, as well as setting up more material in the graveyard for your other Delve spells. Tasigur is a strong piece for slower, mid-range style decks that aim to grind in the long game. Cards such as Satyr Wayfinder come down and help fill the graveyard to ensure casting a fast Tasigur. As such, his primary home in Sanctioned play has been as a sideboard card, or one of a black-centric deck in Modern and Pioneer even years after its initial printing. Beyond his text slot in Sanctioned formats, Tasigur is also a potent option for the Commander format. His graveyard buyback ability is much stronger in a multiplayer setting, where you can ask one player to give you back the exact spell you want to deal with something else on board. Delve also works around one of the format's signature rules, the extra 2 mana that is added to a commander's cost every time you cast it after the first, allowing you to delve away cards in your graveyard to pay for the commander attacks. While Tasigur still sees competitive play to this day, the fact that he's mostly only ever a one-of and is more of a bonus to existing decks instead of a card they plan and build around means he can only really muster the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Soulflayer. Soulflayer is a 6-mana demon with 4 power and 4 toughness. While these stats are fairly unimpressive, the Delve ability allows you to exile up to 4 cards from your graveyard to make it only cost 2 black mana. This alone would still be fairly underwhelming, but Soulflayer gains additional abilities based on what cards were used to delve it. For most of the evergreen creature keywords, if you delve a creature with their ability to cast it, Flayer will gain the keyword. So if you exile one creature with flying, a creature with trample and lifelink, and a creature with death touch, your Soulflayer would have all 4 of those abilities. Soulflayer saw some play in Standard, but wouldn't see proper competitive life until the Pioneer format was invented. While not a meta deck, Soulflayer decks in the format have options to cards like Zetalpa Primal Dawn, which provide a whole host of keywords for the Soulflayer on a single card. The game plan of these decks is to spend the early game filling up the graveyard, then land in a Soulflayer with as many keywords as possible. Of course, failure to get the right keywords on a Soulflayer could lead to it quickly being dealt with, which is why the deck hasn't seen its time in the light as actually meta. But the fact that a singular card is enough to inspire a whole new deck type build around it, and its unique use of the Delve ability is impressive, and warrants taking a spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Temporal Trespass. This card has the highest printed mana cost of any Delve card at a whole 11 mana. In return for this mana cost, you get to take an extra turn. Extra turn spells have existed in Magic since the very first set and Time Walk. While costs and downsides of these spells have always varied, the general average is that the minimum cost one will find on most extra turn spells is 5 mana, like on Time Warp. More expensive extra turn spells often come with benefits along with the extra turn, like how the 10 mana spell Time Stretch costs 10 mana but gives the player 2 extra turns instead of 1. 11 mana for a single turn is far from impressive, but of course this is where Delve comes into play. With Delve, the minimum cost of the spell is 3 blue mana, since Delve cannot pay the cost of the colored mana of the spell. This puts it almost on the same level of the 2 mana Time Walk, a card which is banned in everything except Vintage and considered one of the most powerful cards ever printed. Temporal Trespass with a maximum Delve only costs a single mana more, which on paper is phenomenal. However, that's assuming you have 8 cards in your graveyard to pay the entire Delve cost outright, which isn't very likely in the early game. As such, for a long time, Temporal Trespass was not used in anything despite its on paper rather effective ability. It took until the Pioneer format for a deck to come around that filled the graveyard in this manner and wanted a spell like Temporal Trespass. Now this spell sees play in Arc-like Phoenix decks in Pioneer that fill their graveyard quickly with cheap spells, and then casting Trespass at the end of a long turn of spells for only 3 mana, and doing it all again on the next turn. While Temporal Trespass does exile itself after being cast to avoid being abused, decks like Arc-like Phoenix are able to copy the spell and get even more extra turns whilst resolving. Trespass would maybe be higher on this list for being an actively playable card in a playable deck in Pioneer, but this spell is actually not even the only playable Delve spell in this deck. And while Temporal Trespass mostly sees play in Arc-like Phoenix decks, spells higher on this list see play in decks not only like this one, but various other decks as well. It speaks to the strength of Delve as a mechanic that their playable extra turn spell only managed to take the number 8 spot on this list. And at number 7, we have Gurmag Angler. At face value, it may seem strange seeing a common creature with no ability beyond its Delve cost anywhere on this list, let alone above competitively playable spells like the ones before it. However, Gurmag Angler is one of the most successful Delve cards when it comes to its competitive lifespan. Most formats would scoff at the idea of a 7-mana creature with 5 power and 5 toughness, and not much beyond that. This is not the case for the Pauper format, however, where the only legal cards are commons. In Pauper, Gurmag Angler is a format all-star, and has been one of the most important creatures since before the format became sanctioned. The Pauper format is generally much slower than other formats, with grindy black decks often taking position to power the format. Gurmag Angler is a flexible threat for the deck, able to come down to the mid or late game strategies of the game and apply a great deal of pressure. Pretty much every slower deck in the format, like the Tolarian Terra control decks, runs Gurmag Angler at the full 4 copies. In non-Pauper formats, high-rated cards like the aforementioned Tasigur are the more common picks for decks since they tend to offer more utility. However, in Pauper, those high-rated options are not legal, and thus Angler remains supreme. Delve is such an effective keyword that it's sometimes less about the card itself, and more the fact that it's a card with Delve. Honorable mentions could even be given to Hooting Mandrills, a similar card to Gurmag Angler played less simply because black is the more effective color and higher stats. That said, Mandrills does even see some play outside of Pauper as well as with Angler in decks like Vengevine that want to cast big creatures as cheaply as possible. Gurmag Angler is far and away one of the best creatures in Pauper simply because 1-mana creatures with those stats is pretty hard to match, especially in a format comprised only of commons. Coming in at number 6, we have Become Immense. This 6-mana instant gives one creature plus 6 power and plus 6 toughness until the end of the turn. In competitive Magic, one-off pump spells tend to not be all that competitively viable. In general, it's better to give a creature a more permanent buff, or equip it with something instead of hoping that a buff for a single turn is enough to do the trick. Historically, playable pump spells were cards like Berserk, which could simultaneously be extra damage or a removal spell. Become Immense lacks any sort of versatility like that, and instead opts for sheer effectiveness. In the early days of Magic, 1 green mana at instant speed would have net you Giant Growth, which gives the creature plus 3 power and toughness. In the ideal scenario, Become Immense costs the same as that, but gives you double the power and toughness. For most decks, this is still far from wanted, but the Infect playstyle is where this card sees its most effectiveness. Infect as an ability distributes damage to the player in form of poison counters instead of actual damage. If a creature with Infect does 3 damage to a player, that player takes no damage and instead gets 3 poison counters. If a player has 10 poison counters, they instantly lose the game. With this in mind, for an Infect creature, Become Immense becomes a near lethal amount of damage on its own. As such, many Infect decks leverage small or free pump spells like Invigorate to fill up the graveyard and make their Infect creatures as big as possible. If an opponent isn't careful, Become Immense could land on a Blighted Agent and kill that player out of nowhere. Infect has not been near the top of the meta in quite some time, yet regardless exists in the formats it's legal in more rogue tiers. And whenever Infect does make a resurgence, Become Immense is one of the key pump spells that list runs for pushing in lethal damage as fast as possible. Especially in Legacy variants of Infect, which has more free spells it runs to fill up the graveyard faster and make Become Immense even easier to cast. At number 5, we have Ethereal Forager. First printed in 2020's Commander product, Ethereal Forager as a card was initially designed for more casual Commander games. This 6-mana Delve creature only produces a 3/3 flying body, which isn't all that impressive compared to prior cards on this list. What makes this card so good is that whenever it attacks, you're allowed to return one of the exile cards you used to cast it via Delve back to your hand. Ethereal Forager takes Delve's one downside, needing to exile the cards in your graveyard, and turns it into an advantage. In most formats, the most common cards you exile to Delve are lands, especially in older formats like Legacy where fetch lands exist to fill your graveyard even faster. However, it's rare that someone can pay Delve entirely with lands and irrelevant cards, especially since many decks that run Delve cards are graveyard focused, or at the very least, care about having cards in the graveyard. Forager bypasses this by actively bringing the cards back to your hand, meaning the Delve cost in this case provides you more advantage instead of removing potential resources. And once those spells have gone back to hand, if you cast them again, they'll be right back in the graveyard for a second copy of Ethereal Forager to Delve with. This does require you to be able to protect the whale, but that's something the decks playing it are well equipped to do. Ethereal Forager's most consistent home is in Legacy Delver of Secret decks. Those decks are already built around protecting a small flying creature with a cheap interaction like Daze. Often, someone will use up their counter magic and interaction trying to kill the Delver of Secrets, only for the Delver player to have it answer back with their own counter spells. Then the Delver player can cast Ethereal Forager while your opponent is low on resources and start getting back all those spells and burying your opponent in card advantage. The main reason Ethereal Forager isn't even higher on this list is that it's coming from a Commander product, means it's not legal in formats like Modern, and thus it really only has Legacy as a really strong format for it to contend in. But it contends quite well in that format, slotting in well in a very competitive deck. Of course, this is something that can also be said of the card ahead of it, which is why Ethereal Forager only lands at number 5. And at number 4, we have Murktide Regent. At the time of recording, Murktide Regent is one of the most recent Delve cards printed, having first come out in Modern Horizons 2. It, on the surface, is very similar to Ethereal Forager from the number 4 spot, both being high-costed blue Delve creatures that have 3 power and toughness and flying. Murktide Regent costs 1 more mana, and instead of having the spell buyback ability, it instead gets +1/+1 counter for each instant and sorcerer exiled with its Delve ability. This means Murktide Regent can enter the battlefield with upwards of 8 power, as up to 5 spells can be exiled to help cast it. An 8 power, 8 toughness flyer for 2 mana is an incredible stat line, and even is still quite good for 3 or 4 mana. This is because it has another effect where it continues to get counters if more instants and sorceries leave your graveyard. For example, if you were to cast a second Murktide Regent, your first one would also gain counters for every instant and sorcery exile. This works even if your opponent is the one removing spells. So a card like Rest in Peace would get rid of all your spells in your graveyard, but also grow your Murktide Regent at the same time. Murktide Regent sees play in mini decks quite similar to Ethereal Forager. In fact, mini decks choose to run a split of Murktide Regent and Ethereal Forager together because of how well they synergize. A lot of removal in older formats like Modern and Legacy is specifically tailored to answering the format's most common threats. A big example of this is cards like Fatal Push, which kills almost every threatening creature in the format it's a meta in. Murktide Regent's high mana cost allows it to dodge removal that would kill other common creatures in the format. In general, this is part of the strength of Delve creatures. The ability to cheat out their mana cost means you're getting expensive creatures out much earlier than one would expect. Lightning Bolt is one of Legacy's premier tools of interaction, and will almost never be able to kill Murktide Regent. Murktide is easily the strongest Delve card not currently on any ban list, which is only good enough for the number 4 spot on a list like this. Our last 3 slots are all cards that to this day are on at least one, if not multiple, format ban lists. And at number 3, we have Hogaak, Arisen Necropolis. Hogaak is a strange card in that you can't actually spend any mana to cast it at all. Its only ability on board is Trample, and while that's certainly good on a body with 8 power and toughness, by itself it's nothing special outside of a draft. But the way one plays Hogaak instead of spending mana is by using its 2 keyword abilities. Delve exists to cover the colorless mana, but Hogaak also has an ability which allows the player to tap creatures to cover 1 mana of the creature's cost, which can include the colored cost in this case. As such, a player essentially needs to have at least 2 creatures to tap to cover the color in his cost, then the other 5 can be spent via delving away cards or tapping more creatures. This makes Hogaak extremely easy to play in any scenario, especially since he has 1 more line of ability text that allows you to cast Hogaak from the graveyard. You could then sacrifice Hogaak to a card like Altar of Dementia to further fill your graveyard and keep delving. Essentially, Hogaak was a combo piece that allowed you to keep recasting it and incur more and more advantage. This led to a deck full of cards like Stitcher's Supplier and cheap recursive threats like Bloodghast to put an immense amount of damage on the board as fast as possible and swing for game. This deck would be so dominant in the modern format that the period of time it was legal would later be called Hogaak Summer. Many decks in the format mainline graveyard hate cards like Leyline of the Void in an attempt to slow down the Hogaak player from slamming down their giant threats so consistently and quickly. Cards like Faithless Looting were finally banned in the format due to just how easily it set up the deck's plays, and eventually Hogaak himself would be banned in the format after being legal for only 77 days. The card has since made limited appearances in Legacy since, but nowhere near the dominant levels of it shown in the modern format. It's unlikely that Hogaak will be taken off the modern ban list anytime soon, and has been considered by players and designers alike to be the most egregious design mistake of the original Modern Horizon set. And at number 2, we have Treasure Cruise. As already established, the mana cost on delve spells generally is not something to judge the spells by. Almost no 8 mana sorcery is worth playing in the competitive world of Magic the Gathering. Yet with Treasure Cruise, it has found itself on multiple formats ban lists. This is because Treasure Cruise, in the right conditions, is quite literally Ancestral Recall, one of the first and most powerful spells ever printed. Their effects are identical beyond the delve keyword on Treasure Cruise. Both spells draw the player 3 cards. While it's difficult to get Treasure Cruise to cost a single mana in the first few turns of the game, Treasure Cruise becomes incredibly potent the longer a game goes. Dedicated decks could push this even further by filling their graveyard quickly, but with a card like Treasure Cruise, that level of deck building was not even necessary. Treasure Cruise was so effective that essentially any blue deck in the right format would want to play it. It was an easy way to refill a hand in top deck scenarios, trading off your most irrelevant cards in the graveyard for exchange for a +2 in card advantage. Other delve cards are more balanced in that you're trading these already expanded resources for a threat. Delve is at most fair when it's limited and gives you something more average than exciting when exchanged for how easy it is to cast. Especially with fetch lands and free spells like Force of Will, putting multiple cards in the graveyard before both players had even taken the first turn in Legacy and Modern in specific. Graveyards filled up too fast for a card like Treasure Cruise to not instantly be one of the strongest options around. It was even a common 2 in its initial printing, so it was even available to players in the Pauper format despite that format lacking the acceleration the other formats had. Fast formats were able to abuse it and cast it far earlier than intended. Slower formats were willing and able to wait on the card to eventually be castable, and in the end it was banned in all 3 formats. It's also restricted in Vintage, where the whole main gimmick of the format is that every card is legal, and the most they can do to a card is restricted to a single copy. This 8 mana common was strong enough to be restricted, and yet still only lands at the number 2 spawner list. And the one card that beats it was another blue mana delve spell from the same set. And at our number 1 spot, we have Dig Through Time. Dig Through Time is an 8-drop just like Treasure Cruise, although it costs specifically 6 generic mana and 2 blue, and thus will cost slightly more than Treasure Cruise in the best case scenario. The first major difference between the two is that Dig Through Time is an instant. Instants are infinitely more flexible than sorceries. Using this spell over Treasure Cruise allows the deck to hold up interaction on an opponent's turn, and if said interaction would end up not being important, the player could simply cast Dig Through Time instead. This card is only a +1 in card advantage as opposed to Treasure Cruise, which draws you 1 more card on top of this. However, Treasure Cruise limits you to 3 random cards. And while that's still very good, there's no guarantee what those cards are. In comparison, Dig Through Time looks at more cards and lets you select the 2 most relevant ones for your current situation. So, while you've gotten to draw less cards, you've gotten far more card selection. In Eternal formats, players use spells like Ponder in lieu of cards like Opt, despite being so similar, because Ponder offers the player more selection in their cards. Dig Through Time was as generic as Treasure Cruise, but allowed the player to find more relevant cards more consistently and could be cast on your opponent's turn. Needless to say, pretty much every point against Treasure Cruise's legality also applies to Dig Through Time, and the two were banned together in Modern Legacy as well as being restricted in Vintage. Both spells are legal in Commander, but the only sanctioned format you can play them in is in Pioneer. The format still has them legal mostly because it lacks the fetch lands to really allow decks to turbo them out. And of course, even then, both are still played quite heavily in Pioneer in fair and combo-centric decks. It was even in keycard and Inverter of Truth combo decks that would try to get the graveyard as small as possible before switching it with their deck via Inverter's ability, and winning through Thassa's Oracle after having an empty deck. There was heavy consideration over if Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise would be banned, but instead Inverter was banned and the deck was taken out that way. But throughout all of Pioneer's lifespan, people have wondered if and when these 2 Delver cards would wind up on the ban list like they are in other formats, with some seeing it as only a matter of time, with Dig Through Time being the clear higher level worry of the 2. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.